Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amit Potham from Social Science Para, and it is with utmost pleasure that I welcome you to the 20th lecture of the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture series. The Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture is Social Science Para's flagship public event, with over 2 decades continues to engage the Kathmandu audience through thoughtful discourse and meaningful conversations that resonate far beyond these walls. It is an honor to welcome speakers from around the world to talk to our Kathmandu audience. And this year we are pleased to have with us Professor Nancy Lee Peluso, who will be delivering the lecture titled Remittance House, Remittance Forest, Mobilizing Women's Labor for Forest Transformation. Professor Peluso's work has made tremendous contributions to understanding the intersections of labor, gender, remittance, forest, and social change, and is standard reading for those interested on these topics. I'll keep it to this much from my side and welcome you once again to what is sure to be an engaging and thought-provoking lecture. Before we begin, I kindly request you to switch off your mobile phones to avoid possible distractions. There will be no formal question and answer session following the lecture. However, you are welcome to interact with Professor Peluso informally during the tea session afterwards. I will now request Mr. Deepak Gimali, who himself needs no introduction to this audience here. He is a founding member of Social Science Baha and also as someone familiar with Professor Peluso's work. Mr. Gimali will take us through the more extensive introduction of Professor Peluso. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to all of you. First, a word about Mahesh Chandra Regmi. He lived next door, and he is the scholar of scholars. He contributed significantly to the study of economic history of Nepal and land tenure, and he's also Nepal's first Magsaysay Award winner for that seminal work that he had done. So in his memory, the Baha has established this memorial lecture to keep alive that tremendous concentrated work that he did and contributed to Nepal's overall scholarship. We have today, we are fortunate to have Professor Nancy Peluso to deliver this memorial lecture. We try to make sure that those who deliver the memorial lecture do with their own work also reflect Mahesh Chandra Regmi's scholarship, intense scholarship, and Nancy is one of those who's tremendous work for the last 40 years in the field of forestry, especially in Southeast Asia. Interesting thing, you've all seen the flyer, you know the details, I won't go there, but there's a connection with Nancy and me. We are both what are known as ERGIs, Energy and Resources Group of the University of California at Berkeley. You were there a few years after me, but ERG, as we call it, it was the only truly interdisciplinary founded academic department in the US or anywhere else. Generally, interdisciplinary studies are tagged onto the economics department or the engineering department, but this was designed as an interdisciplinary department and with very rich set of trans and interdisciplinary interactions among all the professors and scholars there. And Nancy was there in the early 1990s as a Sriasi Wantrup postdoctoral fellow. I was there in the mid-80s. Now, I'll just close with one thing. I mean, at ERG, we have had very eminent professors who live on as, even now, they're legends. Professor John Goldman, who was one of the founding professors there, he subsequently became Obama's chief science advisor. John Hart, one of the first people to study climate change, acid rain, and so on. Professor Dick Norgard, Mark Christensen, all of these people, they have earned legends and stories behind them that live on. With Nancy, I can tell you one story, and interesting it is that she has interacted or worked together with a lot of my batchmates, Jesse Rebo, Matt Turner, a whole lot of them, Michael Watts. These are all pretty well-known, famous names. Now, one legend of Nancy, although I must confess I didn't witness it myself, but one legend of Nancy that lives on, and those legends have a habit of seeping even halfway across the world up to here, is when she gave her lectures to a class, the image that survives today as legend is her holding an infant in one arm and writing on the board with another. Now, I think that's an extremely powerful and apt image for the talk that she's going to deliver today. The Remittance House, Remittance Forests, Mobilizing Women's Labor for Forest Transformation. So Nancy, the floor is yours.
I usually have to do a little microphone adjustment when I come up to the floor after tall people. Well, if my phone goes off, I'll turn it off. Okay, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it really is such an honor to be here. I wouldn't ever have imagined that I would end up having a chance to come here, and especially to be able to be a part of this extremely distinguished lecture series. So I very much thank Deepak Thapa for inviting me, and all of SSB for all the wonderful things that they've been doing for me while I've been here and before I came. It's just been, as I said the other night, it's always been a goal of mine to be able to come to Nepal, because it's almost as if Nepal and Indonesia in some ways came to be known in the world of forestry and iconic in the world of forestry. And my work has always been more in Indonesia than certainly than Nepal, but I still think that there are some things that you might find interesting here that are parallels with what's going on in Nepal right now, but in very different ways. So anyway, thank you so much, Deepak, for all that you've done for me. So we're going to see if I can work this stuff. So remittance houses are global phenomena that have transformed rural and agrarian landscapes as transnational labor migration has increased around the world. I will bet that each of you can think about those two words together, remittance houses, and know immediately or have an image in your mind of what it is. But in the Montane forest worker settlement that I am conducting research, the wives, daughters, and mothers of forest workers are remitting their savings from transnational labor migration, paying off long-standing family debts, investing in new commodities, and building remittance houses on state forest land that they do not own. And I thought I would just give you a few views of what the forest looks like in and around this forest worker settlement that I'm going to be talking about soon. So our findings reveal that women's transnational domestic and care work have superseded men's forest plantation labor as the primary economic foundation of household economies. Okay? That's, for me, a very big statement. The savings and small surpluses that these women have captured have reworked colonial and post-colonial era gendered dependencies of laboring families on plantation wages and housing space. Unlike the remittance landscapes observed in smallholder communities, the remittance house on plantation land and in plantation contexts represents a distinctive intersection of labor politics, property relations, forest plantation work, and social reproduction. These women are also creating work on the forest lands for men and women in their families, more work and more remunerative work than what the forest plantation is able to provide. Yet men's employment by the State Forestry Corporation is critical in a very specific way. Their forest work has been remunerated with privileged access to space on the state forest lands on which to build a house. These are resident workers and their families that I'm talking about today. Their fathers and grandfathers cleared and replanted forests between the 1940s and the 1980s. The men or their sons were then expected to become the resident workforce. Customarily, their families moved with them onto the forest land in the Magrasari, or forest workers' settlements. Remittance houses then are evidence of the transformation of historical, gendered, land-labor relations on forest plantations into new forms of commodity production and social reproduction. This is a new era of working relations in the forest and of worker relations to the forest, some of it fueled by social forestry, but other fueled by women's labor on and off the forest. So that's going to be the story that I'm going to unpack for you today, and right now I'd like to start off with a story. Boutini knelt on the terrace of her recently renovated house on a pine forest plantation in East Java as we talked on a sunny morning in February of 2019. She scrubbed the creases where the colorful floor tiles met the house's outer wall and corners, cleaning it fastidiously in anticipation of the party that she would throw for her son's wedding. Teeny had bought this house and had built this house with savings from her 12 years of work in Hong Kong as a live-in housekeeper and elder caregiver. Her remittance house, built on a forest workers' settlement, part of a forest plantation, stood on land that neither Teeny nor her husband, Sukanto, owned. It was flanked by 60 other houses, all on land borrowed from the State Forestry Corporation, a parastatal forest enterprise under Ministry of Forestry jurisdiction. Almost all 60 houses had been renovated or completely rebuilt with remittances. Beginning under Dutch colonial rule and continued by Indonesian lawmakers, state forest land could never be owned by ordinary subjects or citizens. Yet Teeny and Sukanto still invested heavily in the house's construction of permanent materials. The question is, why would they build a permanent house, an expensive permanent house like this, on forest land? Teeny's house exuded a sense of permanence and stability. It was also one of the most beautiful remittance houses in the forest workers' settlement, locally called a magrasari, a Javanese word that for centuries has referred to borrowed land on both forest land and so-called customary land. The front of the house sported pillars, tiled in an eye-catching red and yellow pattern. A fence of thick wrought iron enclosed the newly tiled porch where the house met the top of a steep, cement-covered driveway. The interior contained 3 bedrooms and a front room for receiving guests and for the family's ritual Javanese-style feasts. Teeny had designed the kitchen spaces where those ritual feasts are prepared by family and neighbors. The kitchen occupied 2 large rooms, adorned with wooden cabinets and vinyl countertops, none of which are characteristic of traditional rural Javanese kitchens. A wood-burning 4-burner stove with its own life history of communal, ritual, and family cooking remained the centerpiece of the kitchen out back. In addition, Teeny had equipped 2 fully tiled bathrooms with 3x6 ceramic tubs, both melodiously filling with clean spring water piped in from higher slopes on the mountain. 5 cow pens, each sheltering a fat dairy cow, bought with Teeny's remittances, or the offspring of her first remittance cows, flanked the house on the western side under a tiled roof atop a cement floor. And let me just remind you that milk is not a common part of the Indonesian diet, so these were immediately commodity purchases. The apparent anomaly of women, transnational migrants, using remittances to renovate and rebuild their houses on borrowed forest land to which they have no legal claim, provides a window into changing power relations and social reproduction strategies in plantation communities. It helps explain why forest workers have invested in the permanence of this house, as they are still dependent on the State Forestry Corporation for their access to a parcel of forest land on which to build a house. In this essay, I'm going to examine how women's transnational labor migration has transformed the forest plantation landscape, its resident workers' household economies, and forest plantation labor politics in Montane, East Java. We introduced the concept of a plantation migration nexus to capture how plantation histories shape migration patterns and how migrant remittances reconfigure plantation labor relations. We argued that women's transnational labor is driving the remittance house on borrowed forest land phenomenon, and that their wages and savings are replacing men's wages from forest work as the primary foundation of household economies. Transnational income was sought when local work was insufficient for the most basic social and simple reproduction of their families. Before renovating their houses, women first remitted their earnings to pay off debilitating family debts and to provide for the everyday needs of their households and those of their extended families. Many also invested in dairy cows and other livestock, creating new sources of income that further reduced the family's dependence on plantation wages. Only after these immediate needs were addressed did they turn to the significant investments required for house construction and renovation. We're talking about a particular generation here, a generation that came of age and went to migrate at the turn of the millennium of the 21st century. So plantations, both forest plantations and agricultural enterprises, were one of the primary mechanisms through which global capitalism transformed the Netherlands East Indies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, long before it became the Republic of Indonesia. The simple and social reproduction of plantation workers and their families have always been central to plantation politics in Java, largely because so many workers had no access to land of their own well before the land-grabbing era of our present times. As Sarah Besky has demonstrated for tea plantations in Darjeeling, worker settlements are sites where laborers establish forms of permanence and stability despite their lack of formal land rights. In the 21st century, circular, transnational labor migration has fundamentally altered the politics of plantation work and social reproduction. We conceptualize this shift as the plantation migration nexus, which is a framework that captures how plantation economies and transnational migration mutually constitute each other in ways that transform both land-labor relations and household reproduction strategies. The framework builds on, but extends beyond, classic conceptions of the migration development nexus by emphasizing how plantation histories and the materialities of the forests and other spaces that these plantations occupy specifically shape migration patterns, and how migrant remittances reconfigure plantation landscapes and labor relations. This plantation migration nexus yields specific forms of social differentiation that distinguish it from both smallholder agrarian change and typical plantation labor politics. As Vinay Gidwani and Preeti Ramamurthy have argued, social reproduction is deeply entwined with production, what Katz terms topographies of power that connect distant laborscapes. The remittance houses in the Maghrasati exemplify what feminist scholars have long argued, that social reproduction encompasses much more than domestic maintenance, but rather involves the multifaceted ways that household and community life is sustained through diverse forms of labor. So let me just say a little bit here about the research methods and my context here. This village plantation complex, which is on the top of a mountain in East Java. And just FYI, all of the place names except for East Java that are used in this paper, and all of the human names are all pseudonyms. So, this map shows the layout of the village plantation complex where we did our research. Within our East Java research site, the village plantation complex encompasses 4 hamlets in 2 different villages, made up of privately owned parcels of agricultural land and house yard land surrounding clusters of houses that are settlements and on which people have have land rights, formal land rights. The tea and forest plantations still support worker settlements. They are on plantation land with 60 houses in the forest worker settlement on state forest land and 42 worker households in a tea plantations in Placemont as of 2024. And the land in both of those places is technically held, or at least legally held in a particular way by either the State Forestry Corporation or a plantation, a private plantation that rents, leases the land for a certain period of time from the state. So, and just to give you an idea of what a Magrasati or Magrasadan settlement area might look like, from above, it's just a Google map, a Google picture that we have circled all 60 of the houses that are on and around this Magrasati, and it's just a view from above to give you some kind of an idea of what we're talking about, and the area around it is state forest, the forest plantation. So the analysis draws on fieldwork that we conducted between 2018 and 2024 in these two mountain villages. We employed mixed methods within an ethnographic framework. I lived in the Magrasati with a family every time we went, as did one of my Indonesian research collaborators. Two others lived in different hamlets in our second research village. One assistant and I also conducted research on migration forest relations during visits between 2015 and 2017. We conducted several hundred in-depth interviews and oral histories with migrant and local workers, their families, smallholder settlers, and other historical actors. So, and then we supplemented this with a household survey on work, migration, and land use and land control based on a stratified random sample from our 4 research hamlets. We also analyzed colonial documents, reports, and historical maps from the Leiden Map Library, the National Archives of Indonesia, and the State Forestry Corporation of Java. So, though I'm talking just about a few people today, you can see that we have really, in fact it was very difficult to decide who to talk about because there's so many people that are involved and so many people have varied stories. So borrowed land and living on borrowed land in these mountains is not a new thing. The practice of landless people borrowing land on which to build a house has its origins actually in pre-colonial Java. People who did not have access to enough land to build a house were historically considered the lowliest members of rural society. This created at least 2 classes of rural dwellers in patron-client relations, landholders and landless. And those of you among us who remember or have read research from the 60s, 70s, 80s, is that this was the thing that you thought about with class in rural areas, was access to or control of land, basically. Were you a landowner? If so, how much? And then, were you landless? And later ideas around kind of classes of labor come up with what Henry Bernstein's talking about and trying to differentiate. It's very hard today to think about what constitutes rural class. And therefore, when you see some of the remittance houses that I'm going to be showing you, it's just, and even Boutini's already, it's like, oh, this is not just a poor person. These are people who came from like absolutely nothing. Most of them 3 generations or more born on plantations, and then living on plantations their entire lives. So the idea that they could even build a remittance house would never have occurred to them in years before 1995. So anyway, just keep that in mind when we start talking about people, because I often get mistaken that we're talking about some middle class kind of group here, but it's not. So. This is more what the kinds of houses that look like, and these are kind of among the best. They're the biggest that people used to live in, the simple houses built of forest materials that landless workers built on borrowed land. They were acknowledged as the property of the builders, not that of the landowners. Okay, the houses belonged to them. Local interlocutors told us stories of their or their parents moving on and inherited or purchased houses components, carrying hardwood doors, posts, joints, boards, ceramic roof tiles, and tightly woven bamboo walls to new settlements up and down the hills and valleys of these mountains. Once plantations began allowing workers to build houses on their land or began constructing barracks and other plantation provided housing, landless workers' families came there to live as well, and some moved their houses between plantations. So in 1984, Boutini's father and her older brother moved their family's house from the tea plantation settlement to the Madrasari with the permission of the field forester. They gained access to this housing space with the promise of the two men's future forest labor. In this way, plantations as well as private landholders gained access to cheap or free labor from the entire family. And remember, I just said 1984, not 1884. Okay, we are talking about very feudalist type relationships here. Okay, so, oh, what happened? Okay. Okay, so I just want to tell you something briefly, a very brief bit about the historical development of this forest plantation. We have another paper on this, but I think it's important to kind of lay out a little bit about the history here. The formal boundaries between villages and state forest in this East Java region were established in 1935 by the Netherlands East Indies authorities and later retained as boundaries by the Indonesian Forest Service. In 1961, the State Forestry Corporation took over forest management. The initial forest workers settlement began with just 10 families in the early 1950s, recruited by the field forester to clear forest and create a plantation of mahogany and pine. These first residents built simple houses of bamboo, wood, and leaves on 20 by 30 meter parcels using materials from the forest that they were clearing. Now oddly, once this became a plantation forest, which took 20 years, in fact, of work, well, 30 if you start from 1950 when they first built the Madrasari. The men were never paid wages for their work in establishing a forest full of commercial tree species. They were paid in part with access to the forest lands to build houses of forest materials for the workforce. The building materials came from the forest that they had just cleared. The State Forestry Corporation was oddly not interested in those extant montane forests. They had their eyes set on, their hearts set on, and their wallets set on those teak forests in the lowlands, okay? So we're up in the mountains. This is a different kind of forest. It's a subsistence forest. And as far as they were concerned, there were no commercial species in it, so they didn't care what happened to it. But then they decided to turn it into a plantation. Okay. So of course, when you're making a plantation, the question is, how are you going to pay for it? Well, if you're making a teak plantation and you're cutting down teak trees that happen to be there, there's your money right there. But when you're up in these mountains, there's something different going on. So exploitation comes to mind. And so what men were paid for doing this work was access to forest land to build a house. The building materials came from the forest that they had just cleared. They were also paid with privileged access to reforestation work, and I know this is something that went on across India and also in Myanmar and, well, in Burma at the time. Taunia, or the Taunia system, or in Indonesian what they call tumpang sari, agroforestry system of reforestation, where the planter of the trees who's planting 4 rows on the outside of forest species, let's say pine, gliticidia, and then in the middle, they plant food crops. But that's part of their pay, okay? No pay for them. Women helped to a certain degree with that, with the food planting and so on. So men were also paid with access to all those species that they had cut down for firewood and non-commercial timber species, and paid by the allowing, and they also were remunerated in a way by the allowance of their wives to forage for forest foods, which is what they did before the plantation went in. But as time went on, these various developments shaped the labor and settlement patterns and changed the ecology of the forest, obviously, and changed what kind of labor was possible within them. Okay, so first thing, in the 1960s, there was expanding settlement, okay? There was all kinds of political upheaval, there was economic hardship, there was lots of ecological problems, lots of droughts, rats. I mean, it was a horrible decade, and you had huge political violence going on. And as people were running away from other places, they came to this forest area as they might have in earlier years, seeking refuge, seeking work, seeking places to live. Okay. Second, and so the Magrasati, I said, it started out as having just 10 houses in it. The Magrasati expanded as all these workers start migrating in, and it grew to 89 houses and 104 households who were living in those houses by the late 1970s. So, second, the 1970s were characterized by the acceleration and deepening of transformation of the montane forest into plantations. Men had primarily worked in forest logging and planting, while women foraged in the forest and worked as day laborers on the tea plantation during those decades. In fact, those women's tea plantation day wages were absolutely critical already to household reproduction. Why? As I said, the men were not being paid in cash for most of their forest work. The late 1970s were a period of crisis and transition. Multiple crises occurred, including the death of the forest workers settlement leader in 1979, and then a period of devastating rain and a deadly landslide from an adjacent area of the forest in 1978, and increasing competition for scarce jobs. The convergence of these major threads of local socio-environmental history led to various migration responses by Magrasati residents, culminating in 1981 in government-sponsored transmigration programs. These programs relocated 75% of the Magrasati households outside of Java. The number of households was drastically reduced, and by 1980, the mixed mountain forest land had been fully converted to monocultures of mahogany and pine, transforming the new labor processes and limiting traditional forest-based subsistence activities. Unlike the commercially valuable lowland teak forest, the montane forests were now containing species of market value, but much more limited. Okay. Let's go here. Now, these are already modified landscapes because people have already started planting elephant grass, but since I came into it during the last 10 years, it was difficult to get a before and after picture. So by the time of the transformation in the ecology of the forest to a simplified plantation, workers faced unemployment. And in fact, this was the worst thing that could happen to the workers in the plantation. The pine, it was planted for resin, okay? And the resin wasn't really going to be ready for 10 to 12 years. So they fill up the plantation, women lose the habitat for foraging. There's still places that they can go because as you might have seen, I should have explained the map a little bit better, but there's a protection forest that's on top of all of this, and people could still go up there and get firewood, and there was also some of the remnants of the woods that were left behind that people could still collect firewood and so on. But men also basically were at a standstill because most of the forest, I mean, they didn't plant it all at once, but there was still a good deal that could not be harvested yet for the pine resin. And in addition to that, other parcels were planted in mahogany, and that you had to wait 40 years, or maybe 10, 15 years if they got around to thinning it. So jobs, employment, they're so dependent on the forest, and the habitat had changed so much. So the historical development of the forest plantation had also reshaped gendered labor divisions and access to the forest in significant ways. In the 1930s, when the land was reserved as state forest land, becoming part of the colonial era political forest, use of the forest was to supplement household subsistence. Access to land for the occasional corn crop, women's foraging, and men's work grazing the livestock of better-off farmers. Some couples or young families basically lived in the forest, staying overnight to guard crops or to hunt. Some gave birth in the forest, making a claim to the spaces that they lived by burying the placenta of their newborns in the land around these temporary houses made of forest products. We know about subsistence forest use, and we know about plantation conversions. And I think that's one of the things that it's part of the story, of course, but it's also part of a story that's been told. It doesn't really contribute that much that's new, because it's really in the next part of the history that different things start happening, and people don't just sit there and wait for bad things to happen to them. So 20 years later, when forest managers set the plantation development in motion, I guess I have I'm gonna sit here. So I'm sorry. Okay, so while some of the work in the extant forest had always been gendered, men cut down most trees and supervised more of the grazing of animals. Women foraged for food, and historically, both men and women participated in simple house building, collecting firewood and leaves. However, the plantation regime increasingly defined the forest plantation work as a domain exclusively for men, okay? So the land use itself, in some ways, determines this, but you also start hearing, a kind of mantra that forest work is men's work, okay? Now, by the end of the 1970s, the foresters and sub-district officials were regarding the plantation and protection forests as severely threatened by unauthorized users. There were all those people who had moved in. So migration into the forest had been overwhelming during that previous two decades, and more conflicts and confrontations with foresters became rampant as livelihood options narrowed. And that, of course, was one of the reasons for the targeted transmigration project. Now, with 75% of the Magrasati houses gone, the settlement contracted. Field foresters told those living on the Magrasati outskirts to consolidate. People moved around, and this dramatic reduction in population did not preclude the emergence of new migration modalities in the 1980s and beyond. Largely because if we only look at population reduction as happening with the transmigration scheme, we don't see the forest. That plantation forest was missing work opportunities because of its youth. So at this time then, two other state interventions besides resettlement in the regional political economy included the introduction of dairy cows through a government program for upland development, and which entailed the infrastructure for dairy cow production and milk sales infrastructure through the 1980s and early 90s. But at that time, Magrasati residents saw little of these cows. Most of them were typically taken up by elites who had land certificates or other collateral to guarantee their credit payments. A few plantation-based men took care of other cows in exchange for the first and third calves and a share of the milk earnings that they had. But only 4 or 5 men benefited in this way. Some forest workers began migrating temporarily because the forest work had slowed. Women seeking more support had gone to nearby cities, and some to Surabaya or Jakarta to work as housekeepers and babysitters, or even as factory workers. For those who did not want to seek work on the declining tea plantation, rural-urban migration became the source of support for these Magrasati-based sites. And the other intervention that I mentioned earlier was in the establishment of a transnational migration infrastructure for domestic and care workers aimed mostly at women, but which really started out in the lowlands and didn't really have labor brokers coming through and trying to recruit people at this time in the mountains. Okay, so we see the emergence of the first three of women's transnational migration in about the early 1990s. The first 3 women to go to Hong Kong in 1992 were all unmarried. One was divorced with adult children, the other 2 had high school degrees. The office jobs available to us with our high school degrees paid so little that we chose to work in Hong Kong as domestic workers, one of them explained. They were overqualified, but all needed the work and the cash. They sent money home to support family members and pay off debt. All eventually invested some remittance money in dairy cows to support the families and made relatively simple renovations to their parents' houses during their first 2-year contracts. Remember that dairy cows needed pens, a place to milk and be fed, and the foresters no longer allowed dairy cows, or before they used to allow meat cows or work cows to graze in the forest, but they didn't allow that with the dairy cows. By this time, but they would allow owners to build pens on the Magrasati land. The cows had to have food, and the grass and other fodder that they ate had to be collected from various places. The 3 women built or renovated their own houses during subsequent contracts, and the 2 high school graduates remained for 3 contracts, The other woman stayed for 6 or 7, a good 14 years that she lived in Hong Kong, and became a broker herself. She ended up buying land in a village below the Makrasati and eventually built a house, cow pens, etc. on private land. Now, starting in 1997, the Asian economic crisis brought many of the men and women who were working in cities back to their villages as construction projects and urban development ground to a halt. So for investors and developers, the Asian economic crisis may have struck as a monetary production crisis, but for workers dependent on wages, it became a crisis of social reproduction. They were cobbling together things from many different sources. The event also sparked a movement against President Suharto, dictator for 32 years, and led to his forced resignation in 1998. Forests came under attack during that time, just like urban areas were burning. And across the montane forests, the following years saw increasing turmoil, lack of work caused by the crisis in rural as well as urban areas, and that eventually led to another 3 years of violence against the forest in massive illegal logging. Much of this was done by men who had lost their urban jobs and at the encouragement of one of the new presidents. What this also led to, it was in the early 2000s, some men began planting elephant grass between pine trees on forest land that had been opened in small patches, letting light in through the open canopies. In other words, they initiated new means of access to the forest understory. And by the early 1990s, the late 1990s, they had also begun tapping into the pine resin, and it was a requirement if you were going to live in one of the remittance houses that you had to be working for the foresters. Okay, and again, it's this carryover of what was paid. So that house access was paid. They started getting paid for piecework, basically for selling the resin to the foresters. But again, it was paid at such a very low rate that they really just couldn't survive on that. Women's work was just absolutely fundamental to it, whether it was still in the tea plantation, whether they had gone to a local city, or whether they signed up eventually to go for transnational labor. So there's these new pressures constraining formal forest plantation work, right? You've got patches. Wasn't clear-cut in illegal logging. It was more surreptitious. And the people around the Makrasati had an interest in saying, it wasn't us, it wasn't us. But later, when they were able to kind of benefit from this by starting to plant elephant grass in those gaps, in those places in the forest where the canopy was letting in enough light to be growing these other things. And there was a new forest law also. It hadn't really been enacted in this place yet, because that usually takes a number of different steps. But what was coming was recognition that people could use the entire forest understory for planting their own crops. The problem was, if there was a canopy, then it was very limited in what kinds of crops they could grow. So you have all these kind of new pressures and new kinds of openings, constraining and creating very, very micro kinds of opportunities in formal forest plantation work. And Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore began restructuring their economies in the wake of the Asian economic crisis. The Indonesian government also expanded their programs at this moment to facilitate more transnational employment for Indonesian care and domestic workers, and specifically targeted women. These state-funded infrastructures had long enabled women to migrate for work without having to accumulate large amounts of cash in advance. But the repayment of travel costs and training was enacted through employment agencies, and though that was also exploitative, I mean, none of this is not exploitative, but it was also attractive to younger women in their late teens and early 20s because they didn't have to have the money up front, which was always what was in shortage for them. Okay, so many of their mothers and aunts had been engaged in housekeeping and childcare in provincial and district cities since the 1980s, and they also learned from the successes of the very first 3 women who had migrated transnationally before the crisis. So, I'm going to go back to talking a little bit about these processes in the Makrasati and think about remittance economies and household transformations. So for Butini and other women from the Makrasati who followed these pioneers, transnational migration represented a path to escape long-standing debts and improve their family's circumstances. Before renovating their houses, women first directed their remittances to paying off those debts that I mentioned earlier and providing for the everyday needs of their households and extended families. During the first 5 to 7 months abroad, they could only save small amounts as they repaid the costs of travel and training. Later in their contracts, they began saving for investments in dairy cows and other livestock. Thank you. They began saving for investments in dairy cows and other livestock that family members raised during the women's absence. The income from milk sales eventually became a crucial source of daily household income for many or most households. Cows created work on the forest plantation. These remittance-financed dairy cows transformed modes of social reproduction and plantation land use. Milk for daily needs, the effort to have 3 or more cows to ensure at least one was producing, and the acquisition of goats to save for emergencies. All these were new social reproduction strategies that became common across the Magrasari. No one could ever afford this before. And social forestry policies enabling more comprehensive planting throughout the understory also played a role in the transformation. But the broader contextual processes were more important. Men's daily activities on the forest land shifted from full-time forest work to a combination of less intensive forest labor and animal husbandry. The men planting elephant grass between pine trees on forest land used it to feed their own livestock and to sell as fodder to others. Elephant grass that had access to light could generate 5 harvests a year, okay? And that really valorized the forest understory to the benefit of the workers planting it. Property rights in these plots also developed informally. That's a whole nother story in itself. And this fodder was privately owned. It was grown on forest land. It came from, people got these little plots, claimed these little plots right after the violence and during the violence that was going on in the forest, and finding a spot where there was a little bit of light coming through and maybe helping a tree or two blow over in the wind. So unlike previous generations of plantation workers who rarely accumulated sufficient savings for substantial housing improvements, transnational women migrants then have leveraged their earnings to create both economic security and improved living conditions. Living on the forest, they lived on the forest land still, their houses, their cows were built pens and lived on the forest land right next to them, and they were controlling, the cows needed fodder, and so the women's labor was also enabling the purchase of initial seedlings or the finding of initial seedlings, or other ways in which they were able to mobilize those funds for other things that the cows needed as they were being brought up. I mean, these were not organic cows, let's face it. So they are brought in from other places, and that's not part of the story, unfortunately. These foreign currency remittances facilitated novel land use strategies at home in Indonesia, with livestock production, milk sales, food vending, and fodder provisioning expanding largely because of transnational women workers funding it. As their financial resources have grown, these women have increasingly directed their savings towards the substantial investments required for house construction and renovation. And in fact, to me, this was a forest-based revolution that was led by women, but not in some kind of organized, orchestrated, planned way. So, back to Butini. By the time Butini first migrated to Hong Kong in 2000, transnational labor migration had become an established, if still uncommon, practice among women from the forest plantation settlement. Unlike the pioneers who had been unmarried, Tini left behind her husband Sukanto and their 2 young children, ages 7 and 5. Their circumstances reflected the increasingly difficult conditions for forest worker families at the turn of the millennium. Tini and Sukanto had lived on the Magrasari in a simple bamboo and wood house near their parents' homes since their marriage in 1993. While Sukanto collected pine resin in the forest plantation, Tini worked in Surabaya as a domestic worker before returning to the Magrasari to start a family. Their decision for Tini to migrate transnationally came after a period of mounting debt and financial insecurity. Every month we borrowed more just to eat, Sukanto recalled. The resin work paid so little, and there was never enough to cover what we needed for the children's schooling. Teeny's migration strategy unfolded in distinct phases. During her first 2-year contract, she focused on paying off family debts and meeting those basic household needs. Her mother and siblings helped care for her children while she was away, with Sukanto continuing his forest work. Before returning at the end of the first contract, Teeny had managed to save enough to purchase a pregnant dairy cow, an investment that would provide ongoing income through milk sales. After a brief one-month visit home, Teeny signed a new contract with a different employer in Hong Kong, beginning a pattern of sequential contracts that would continue for several years. During her second and third contracts, Sukanto used some of her remittances to acquire the rights to a larger house site in the Magrasati, paying compensation to another worker family for the labor that they had previously invested in clearing and leveling the land. He disassembled their bamboo house and rebuilt it on the new site, an intermediate step toward their eventual permanent house. This period also saw a significant shift in the household economy. Sukanto divided his time between collecting pine resin and tending to their growing herd of dairy cows, which had expanded to 3 animals by 2006. The income from milk sales gradually surpassed his pine resin earnings, reducing the family's dependence on both the plantation and on Teeny's remittances for their daily needs. In 2006, Teeny returned to the Magrasati after 6 years of mostly continuous work abroad. She stayed for 5 years at home, during which time she had another child. This extended period at home allowed her to strengthen family relationships and participate in community life, but the goal of building a permanent house remained unrealized. In 2011, with their youngest daughter now 4 years old, Teeny returned to Hong Kong with the explicit intention of saving for house construction. The second time I went to Hong Kong, Teeny explained, I wanted to build a real house, one that would last forever, not like our parents' houses that needed rebuilding every few years. So during this 6-year period of uninterrupted work abroad, Teeny maintained daily contact with her family through phone calls, directing Sukanto in the gradual process of house construction. Their approach was incremental, first purchasing cows as a form of savings, then selling several to buy construction materials like sand, foundation stones, and wood for framing. Local construction workers, many of them neighbors and relatives, were hired to pour the foundation and frame the structure. Again, women creating work for local men. Women are creating the work for local men. Throughout this process, Teeny remained intimately involved in design decisions despite her physical absence. And this is her house kind of in progress. So when Teeny finally returned in 2017, she used her accumulated savings to complete the house described in our introduction, with its tiled terraces, bathrooms with ceramic fixtures, and modern kitchen spaces. The house stands as a monument to her years as transnational laborer, embodying both material improvement and symbolic permanence on forest land. Significantly, Teeny's reintegration into the community involved deliberate efforts to participate in traditional social practices. When I came back, I made sure to help with cooking for every ritual or ceremony in the neighborhood, she said. People need to know that I'm happy to be back as a member of the community, even with a nice house. Not long afterwards, she announced to me that she had taken her former employer's number out of her telephone. This negotiation of status and belonging highlights how returned migrants try to balance their newfound material resources with community relationships. Bhumika, another woman from the Magrasati, was involved in a different kind of extended, almost continuous absence. Her migration trajectory involved periods of return and family reconnection. At the time of our research, Mika had maintained continuous employment in Hong Kong for nearly 24 years, returning home only for brief visits every few years. Her remittance house, while less elaborate than Teeny's, still represents a significant improvement over the original forest material structure. What distinguishes Mika's case is the intergenerational dimension of her own remittance investments. Not only has she renovated her own house in the Magrasati, but she has also financed her son's construction of an adjacent house, creating a small compound of remittance houses on the forest land. This intergenerational pattern reflects how women's transnational work can span decades, sustaining not just immediate needs, but enabling longer-term family development strategies. I wanted my sons to go to college, but they all stopped after middle school. I paid for his wedding and helped him to start raising cows, Mika explained during a visit home. He's renovated his house further by selling milk and a cow. Despite her prolonged absence, Mika has maintained a central role in family decision-making through regular phone calls and by controlling the allocation of her remittances. Her son, who now works as a motorcycle mechanic in the nearby town, acknowledges his mother's sacrifices and financial support. Everything we have came from my mother's work in Hong Kong. The house, my education, though only through middle school, my wedding, everything from my mother. And by the way, her youngest child was a girl. She went to college, she graduated a couple of years ago, and also just got married. That Mika paid for and was able to come home for the wedding. Mika's case illustrates how women's transnational labor can reshape generational relationships and create new pathways for social mobility that were unavailable to earlier generations of forest workers. The adjacent houses of mother and son represent both continuity with the Magrasati tradition of family settlement and a rupture with previous patterns of poverty and limited opportunity. Mika's case illustrates how women's transnational labor can reshape generational relationships and create, oh, I just said that, I'm sorry. Okay, so let me move on. One more on generational differences and emerging patterns. As transnational migration has become normalized within the Magrasati community, younger women are approaching migration and housing investments differently from their predecessors. Unlike earlier migrants who typically married before migration or migrated after having children, younger women often plan migration as a prerequisite to marriage and household formation. Tini's daughter, Dewi, exemplifies this new approach. At age 21, she's worked in Hong Kong for 6 years and has already purchased 2 adjacent parcels of private land outside the forest on which she planned to build a house. Her mother told us she won't get married until she has her own house ready. She wants to be independent. This shift toward purchasing private land rather than investing in houses on forest land represents an important evolution in migration strategies. While older migrants like Tini and Mika built on forest land because of existing family connections and limited alternatives, younger migrants increasingly view private land ownership as preferable despite its higher cost. Young couples are also developing coordinated migration strategies, often taking turns working abroad to maintain continuous income while ensuring that one parent remains with their children. Pahendro and Bulina, both in their early 30s, alternated her 3-year contracts in Taiwan and Singapore with his travels to Singapore and Malaysia to work informally in construction. She went legally and documented, he went illegally and undocumented. She made more money, she sent home more money. He basically lost a lot of his money because there are periodic raids on these various construction sites, but now it's her that's staying home with babies. So that's, yeah. Anyway, the baby always, or the daughter always has one parent at home, said Hendro, and before they had her, they saved for their future house. And when we met them again, in 2015, they only had half a house built. When we met them again in 2018, they had the 2-story house. So, these emerging patterns suggest that remittance houses represent not just improvements in material conditions, but changing aspirations and strategies across generations. Remember, everybody's still living on forest land, okay? And while older migrants renovated these houses on forest land primarily for improving their living conditions, younger migrants increasingly view housing investments as part of broader strategies for escaping dependence on the plantation economy altogether. Okay. Through the stories told by Butini, Mika, and Budei, we saw that the remittance house phenomenon emerged gradually as women completed successive migration contracts. The houses illustrate new ways that the social reproduction of laborers, families, and communities is entangled with production. They demonstrate feminist arguments that social reproduction is not only about housework, cooking, and childcare, but rather the multifaceted ways that household and community life are sustained through diverse forms of labor. The remittance house in the Magrasati, whether modest renovations or elaborate reconstructions, all represent significant changes in the relationship between forest workers and the State Forestry Corporation. By investing substantial resources in permanent structures on forest land, residents are asserting a form of de facto tenure security that challenges the official temporary nature of their settlement rights. Notably, Magrasati residents undertake these renovations without seeking formal permission from forest managers. As one resident explained, "We don't ask permission to improve our own houses. The land may be borrowed, but the house is ours." This confidence reflects both the long-term occupation of the Magrasati, now spanning 3 generations, and the continued importance of workers to forest operations despite declining employment opportunities. Forest officials maintain an ambivalent stance towards these improvements. A local State Forestry Corporation representative acknowledged, "Officially, these are temporary residences, and residents should inform us of major changes. But in practice, we understand that people want better houses, and as long as they don't expand up beyond their allocated plots, we don't intervene." This tacit acceptance reflects the State Forestry Corporation's limited capacity to enforce strict housing regulations and the political complications that would arise from attempting to restrict improvements in worker housing. The remittance houses have effectively transformed what was once a visibly temporary worker settlement into a seemingly permanent village. As concrete structures with tiled roofs replace bamboo walls and thatch, the physical distinction between the Magrasati and surrounding village settlements has diminished. This material transformation symbolizes and reinforces residents' claims to belonging and permanence despite their lack of formal land rights. These examples also show that, unlike the remittance landscape observed in smallholder communities by scholars such as Deirdre Mackay, Hekton Sachi, Sarah Besky, and your own Ramesh Basunam Ramesh, that the remittance house phenomenon in plantation context represents a distinctive intersection of labor politics, property relations, and social reproduction. The houses embody a certain fixity, the material and symbolic ways that plantation workers establish emplacement despite their lack of formal property rights. So let me just say a few words about some theoretical contributions and comparative perspectives, and maybe I will allow you to fill in the blanks about how this is working in Nepal. The remittance houses on East Java's forest plantation land contribute to our understanding of transnational labor migration in several important ways. By examining these structures through the lens of a plantation migration nexus, we can identify distinctive patterns that both align and diverge from findings in other migrant sending contexts. First, let's think about remittance architecture, because that's something that was one of the first things that I saw when I was trying to think about what was going on in these forests. Remittance houses have been documented across migrant sending regions worldwide, from Mexico and El Salvador to the Philippines and Nepal. In most of these contexts, migrant investments in housing are typically understood as serving multiple functions, improving living conditions, displaying social status, and securing inheritance for future generations. They're also part of class formation, particularly on private land. The Magrasati remittance houses share these motivations, but differ in one crucial respect. They're still built on land to which the builders have no formal rights, but they do have access provided by an access that is provided by the foresters. This distinguishes our findings from most studies of remittance architecture that focus on these smallholder or peasant communities, where migrants typically build on privately owned land. And in fact, the communities that are around this forest, there's all these hamlets that are around the forest and private land, everybody's migrating from those places as well, and they don't have the same kind of constraints on them because they'll turn fields into, or yard land into these remittance houses, okay? And yet, this is not, even in East Java, a small number of people to whom this applies. There are over 120 madrasari that are all over East Java that were built specifically in the mountains because those mountain forests were going to need long-term labor forces. Or at least that was what was anticipated when no one could imagine that these remote forest areas would turn into kind of little cities of their own eventually. And in fact, I have seen pictures in the very far end of Eastern Java in Banyuwangi where remittance houses are built next to city streets on forest land that was somehow occupied during the Japanese occupation, and basically they were never pushed off. So it's phenomenal to see those kinds of pictures. It's an even more striking picture, but here, this plantation and migration thing is still in some kind of tenuous ways tied together, particularly because of the land rights issue. So anyway, you know, Sarah Lopez found that migrants invested in elaborate houses on family land in Jalisco in Mexico, and that this for them was a symbol of success and attachment to their communities of origin. And what Deirdre Mackay documented was how remittance houses in the Philippines, constructed on ancestral land, served as physical manifestations of migrants' continued membership in village society. It's about having a long-term claim. I mean, because a lot of the people that migrate at first are the ones who didn't have land to begin with. And we're not talking about even people who have lots of land. We are not talking about areas where you've got these huge haciendas of land that are owned. These are small. When I talk with a woman who bought Budemi, who bought a piece of land, you know, the one that was 15 years old when she left for Hong Kong, and then buys 2 pieces of land in a village nearby, those pieces of land were about 500 meters squared each. If you planted that in corn, you know, how long are you going to eat that corn? So this is the dynamic. I mean, you're getting all these iconic private landscapes also in Java that are changing, where one village estimated, when I first went there in 2015, estimated about 25 to 50% maybe of the land in that village, of the agricultural land in that village, had been converted from irrigated rice land, terrace irrigated rice land, to using the terraces for planting elephant grass. It's anathema to traditional agrarian studies. And it's just, that's why to me, when you sit back and think about all of these implications, and they come from women who could never have afforded, families that would never have afforded the collateral that was necessary when they introduced these aid projects that brought the cows into the thing, and then were able to benefit in the aftermath of that from the milk infrastructure that had to be built up, because they had to have someplace to take that milk, and they didn't have that when they first brought the cows in, okay? They had to ride their bicycles with these milk cans on the back, quite long distances, and sometimes in the hot tropics, it would spoil on the way to the cooling station. So anyway, back to architecture. I'm obviously more excited by the other stuff, but the architectural forms of these remittance houses also reveal patterns of what Verdevec has termed cultural remittances. Well, and these studies in other regions document how migration influences architectural styles, creating hybrid forms that incorporate elements from destination countries. The interiors of these madrasah houses primarily reflect domestic Indonesian, especially Javanese, ideals of modern housing with tradition and ritual use that is still ongoing. This is one of the most frequent, the place where these rituals, these life rituals, 3, 7, 40 days after death, years after death, 2 years after death, 1,000 days after death, you know, the celebrations of weddings, all of these things. There's so many ritual meals and feasts. You need a big kitchen where lots of women can come and sit on the floor and cook all of the special foods that they need. They do this still all of the time, and that as well, this social reproduction ritual in itself also creates this sense of belonging, sense of ownership, and when the remittance house enables that, and it's a more pleasant environment in which to do it, you don't have to be sitting on the floor, on the dirt floor. It's a continuation of a very, very long project, but people are just in a slightly different situation. Our findings also contribute to understanding the gender dimensions of transnational migration and remittance economies. Studies from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Mexico also have documented how migration reshapes gender relations in sending communities. I talked about some of those today, though they had varying outcomes depending on the gender patterns of mobility in those other places. One idea, for example, that comes from Rebecca Elmhurst is this idea of the stretched household, where you've got women that are in their own villages or families, and then someone from the house will go to another place. And this, she first showed it from these resettlement sites, where people were actually given 2 hectares of land to work and given houses to live in, and it was still not enough to live on because the soils in the places that they lived were completely different than what they had in Java. So the remittance houses on forest plantation land exemplify what Gibson Graham have termed spaces of possibility, alternative economic arrangements that challenge plantation dependencies while still operating within their constraints. These new arrangements are restructuring gender relations, labor politics, and spatial practices in ways that demand new theoretical frameworks for understanding agrarian change in plantation contexts. So in conclusion, the remittance houses on forest plantation land in East Java represent a significant transformation of both the physical landscape and social relations within forest plantation communities. By investing in more permanent structures on borrowed state forest land, women transnational migrants and their families are asserting claims to place and belonging that challenge conventional understandings of plantation labor politics. Our concept of a plantation migration nexus offers a framework for understanding how historically rooted and gendered land-labor relations shape contemporary migration patterns among working-class women who were born, grew up on, and in some way or another worked on forest or tea plantations. We also show how migrant remittances in turn reconfigure those relations. This bidirectional relationship led to the counter topographies of forest work that women created on the forest plantation land, making the remittance forest a newly gendered political forest space. Women have created forest-based jobs for their family members while they are away, and for themselves when they return home. It is women's labor that linked two distantly situated places through parallel processes of economic restructuring and different positionings in what Naidu has called social reproduction circuits. Indonesian women working in Hong Kong as domestic workers are exploited in many different ways. This is not in question. However, some of the conditions of their working environments and the provision of a concrete way to travel first, pay later, have empowered them to save enough to invest in what they call more appropriate, or luwe layak, houses. This comes only after many years of enduring long hours for low pay and a great deal of personal sacrifice. Nevertheless, they managed to avoid some of what Marcel Parenas and Rachel Silvey have called precarity chains in reference to Indonesian and Filipino women working in the United Arab Emirates. Overall, the Magersari remittance houses and their situation within a remittance forest illustrate and illuminate 4 key dynamics in the contemporary conjunctural moment that we have discussed as a specific plantation migration nexus. First, the shifting income sources of household economies away from meager and inadequate men's earnings from tapping pine resin on the plantation to the higher levels of women's transnational earnings. Second, the strategic use of remittances to reduce plantation dependencies through diversified income sources on the forest lands, like dairy cows, has spurred a major reorientation of work and earnings on the land. These new forms of commodity production are controlled by the workers and their family members on the forest plantation's land. Third, the transformation of temporary settlement privileges into de facto claims of permanence through material investments in remittance houses on forest land has deepened residents' sense of belonging and ownership in the village plantation complex, confounding the expectations of property theorists and political economists alike that insist on full ownership to account for improvement. Fourth, the changing aspirations across generations as new generations of young adults born in the Magrasati increasingly seek to exit the forest plantation economy. This exit option has further reduced some families' dependencies on the forest plantation as a source of employment, though their new work as dairy producers remains dependent on access to the forest lands for their own and their cows' housing. Conversely, it is the forest plantation's continued need for resin tappers that also deters foresters from taking back the land and evicting the resident workers. They have quotas to fulfill. This is related to the larger political economy of forestry and new social forestry in Java, which we've discussed in other papers. And for your benefit, I'm not going to go into here. But the losses of forest to environmental violence across the island during the first year of the millennium also played a role in that relationship and in the perception of that relationship between the foresters and the local people. Finally, we have shown that women's transnational migration from forest worker settlements in the mountains of East Java represents a strategic engagement with global labor markets that enables new forms of agency within the constraints of the plantation economy. The remittance houses stand as physical manifestations of women's labor and the changing political economy of social reproduction in rural Java. As plantations worldwide continue to face labor challenges and rural communities increasingly engage with transnational migration, the Plantation Migration Nexus Framework offers a lens for analyzing the complex interplay between historical land relations, gendered labor patterns, and emerging strategies for household reproduction. The apparent paradox of substantial investments in housing on borrowed land reveals not poor decision-making, but rather strategic adaptation to structural constraints, adaptations that are gradually transforming the very foundations of plantation power and social relations. Thank you for sitting through this long talk. Do we have time for questions or not? Probably not, right? No time for questions. Should I sit down? Is it my turn to sit down? Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you, Professor Paluso, for your insightful deliberation on how women's transnational migration shapes rural landscapes, revealing the complex relationship between labor migration and agrarian change, and helping us better understand the socio-economic and political dynamics behind the emergence of what you call remittance forests. I'd like to remind you all that the video and audio recordings of the lecture will be available for access on our website. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us here for this session today. Had it not been for the support shown by all of you who come here every year, this event would not have been the same. With that, I would like to invite everyone to tea in the adjoining hall. As you exit the lecture hall, please don't forget to pick up your copy of the lecture. Thank you very much.